Holy flowers floating in the air were all these tired faces in the dawn of jazz America. This is the Bureau of Lost Culture. I'm Stephen Coates, and that was Jack Kerouac in a very rare recording held in the collection of the British Library Sound Archive. We're going to hear more about it later because this episode of the Bureau of Lost Culture is dedicated to the Beats, William Burroughs in particular, and friends. And it's curated, collected and played out for us by Steve Cleary from the British Library Sound Archive. Steve is the lead curator of drama and literature recordings. He's been there since 2003. And we're also going to hear a recording we did a couple of years ago with Barry Miles, the Capital's chronicle of the counterculture, again about William Burroughs and his time in London, along with some rare and wonderful recordings. The British Library Sound Archive is one of the biggest collections in the world of recordings. Over 1 million discs, 185,000 tapes, and many other sound and video recordings from all over the world. And Steve is going to play us just a few of them today. Some in particular from a collection that he is himself very interested in, the counterculture collection, I suppose you could call it. And Steve has worked for the British Library since 1994, but I'm not going to tell you any more about him. He can tell you about him himself. Welcome, Steve.
Hello, Stephen. Thank you for inviting me.
You're very welcome. Steve, where did it all begin?
Well, I started at the British Library over 25 years ago as a temporary library assistant, in fact. So I was looking for a job, and I was quite attracted to the British Library because in those days, pre-internet, once a book was out of print, I mean, I've always been a reader, it could be hard to track down. Nowadays, it's quite easy, and it's just a question of whether you can afford such and such an item or not. And the fact that the British Library was said to house every book in the world, or in fact, every book published in the UK, or that's their aim, one of their aims, was the attraction, really.
Is that true? I mean, is that so? That's the aim. And I mean, how many books does that involve then? Every book that's been published in the UK?
I don't know the figures, but there is a Legal Deposit Act. So if you publish a book, even if you make it in a shed in your back garden and there's only 6 copies, you are legally obliged to deposit. Well, actually, 6 copies would need to be more than 6 copies because there's 6 legal deposit libraries, so you wouldn't be left with anything else. But
if you're probably 7, you've actually got to stick them all 6 of them in.
A short limited edition.
And the British Library are obliged to take them, are they, and put them somewhere?
I don't know if they're obliged. I mean, they welcome them. It's not really ever been a problem, I don't think. But there's no corresponding legal obligation regarding sound recording.
Well, I mean, let's dig into that. I mean, so for you, 1994, it's quite a long time ago now, Steve, I have to tell you. So you started off in books and moved into sound. I mean, how did that happen?
I got a job as an assistant to the curator of drama and literature recordings. And that was kind of my apprenticeship. I mean, at the time I first worked at the Sound Archive, it was a separate building in South Kensington. It was still part of the British Library. And in something around 1997, I think, we moved into the big building, the then new building on the Euston Road.
I've dug around in your amazing basement.
Yeah, a lot of the material is in the basement. Some's in our facility in Yorkshire. The offices and other facilities are kind of dotted around. But there was a trade-off. I mean, it's positive on balance because we've got much better technical facilities, which we didn't really have properly in the old building. And we're much more integrated with things like exhibitions that the British Library do and so on and so forth.
Well, I mean, speaking of that, I mean, you have in those years and in recent years curated quite a few exhibitions. I mean, you did 140 years of recorded sound. in 2017, 2018. We had a little piece in that. I was very pleased to do. Punk, 1976, 78. That was the dates of Punk, not of your exhibition. That was in 2016. That toured a bit as well, didn't it, that one? That was a very popular show, wasn't it? I saw it in Liverpool, I think.
The punk rock exhibition, the version in Liverpool was quite different. We worked with our co-curator, Sir Colin Fallows from Liverpool John Moores University. And it was augmented with a lot of material relating to Eric's Club that came from the LJMU archives. And the LJMU archives are pretty interesting. Colin has for about 20 years been strategically building up a sort of punk and counterculture archive, and that contains John Savage's England's Dreaming archive, which we drew on quite a lot for the punk rock exhibition at the British Library. An International Times archive, Barry Miles. Stuff about the Oz obscenity trial. All these things kind of complement each other. I mean, in the British Library Sound Archive, we have audio tapes of the Oz obscenity trial.
The thing is that if there are over 1 million discs, over 185,000 tapes, and all that other stuff, drama and literature recordings, oral history, English accents and dialects, classical pop world, traditional music recordings, wildlife and environmental stuff, it's a huge amount of stuff, isn't it? And I mean, drama and literature is your department, but also you have kind of focused on countercultural stuff as well, haven't you?
Sound recording was invented in 1877, but pre-World War II, there aren't that many recordings of famous writers. There are no recordings of Thomas Hardy, for example, who lived into the age of sound recording. So a lot of it comes from the 50s and onward. The spoken word industry on vinyl was basically kicked off by Cadman Records in New York in around about the mid-50s, early to mid-50s, with Dylan Thomas. So the beat writers and people like that were kind of around at the right time, if you think about the technology. So there are no recordings of Percy Shelley, but there are many, many recordings of Allen Ginsberg.
Right.
I mean, he may be one of the most recorded poets of all time, but that's simply because he kind of lived at the right... Well, it's not
coincided with the technology actually being sort of readily available.
Yeah, and in Ginsberg's case, obviously, he was a performer, a regular performer of his work as well.
Well, Steve, why don't we just dive in, and I'm just going to play your first selection, and then we can talk about it.
He doesn't care about flavor. Watch it. He spotted us. He's getting away. Hop into my custom-built grocery cart. This button releases a smoke screen out the back.
The name is Clem Snide. I am a private eye. I will take any identity, anybody. I will do anything difficult, dangerous, or downright dirty for a price.
Me from the grocery cart and knocking down gold noodle at the checkout counter. We at Prince Macaroni have an expression for that.
What is it?
We call it using the old noodle.
I was afraid that was it. 3 dozen eggs when you buy Prince Egg noodles. Get details at your...
Now, try this. Take a walk, a bus, a taxi. Do a few jerry errands in these foreign suburbs here. Who do you think was the first agent on the golf course? Smell hell? Quite by chance, the same stranger here? Outside agent call.
Soft as a raindrop, fresh as the sea.
Bought paregoric, audible click, wall there, excrement. Recall you have 10 minutes here. See this hand calling time? You now have 8 minutes. Here's the telescope. Keep it steady to focus date of death on the road to Spain. Residencia, Madrid. Number 23, Calle de los Desamparados.
Poetos de los Santos from a triple album set called Real English Tea Made Here, issued by the label Audio Research Editions, Colin Fowler's label, collected from some of Barry Miles' recordings in the Sound Archive. Steve, tell us about them.
It was a distillation of a batch of tapes that run to around 12 hours. The original tapes are now in the British Library Sound Archive. The ones that Colin and Miles selected, like that piece we just heard, or that excerpt we just heard, exemplify how Burroughs applied the cut-up technique that he used in prose to audio recording in a way. So, as your listeners probably know, the cut-up technique was discovered, invented by Burroughs' friend, the painter Brian Gysin, when he cut through some newspapers when he was making a mount in his studio, and they rearranged the text to form new sentences with new meanings in a kind of Dadaist way. I mean, it wasn't 100% brand new. And Burroughs took this idea and ran with it and used it in many of his novels and other works.
That for him was a kind of creative technique, was it, which spread into his other visual and audio work then?
Yeah, they used 2 or 3 different techniques. One was called inching, I believe, when they would sort of move the tape along, and then, essentially it was recording things from different sources at random and juxtaposing them with each other. And it's quite raw, but sort of interesting. I think when you hear Burroughs' voice, that adds definitely a kind of edge, a sinister edge, and often a blackly humorous edge.
He recorded that in London, did he?
Possibly. If we look at the 12 hours of tapes in their entirety, they're quite varied. There are recordings he made when he lived in London, a flat in Duke Street, St James, near Piccadilly Circus. Some of these, I don't know if you say they have research value so much as kind of curiosity value. He's obviously left the tape recorder running while he's just talking to people in his flat. Some of it's quite incongruous. You can hear the 1972 Benson and Hedges Gold Cup on the TV at one point, which you don't really associate with Burroughs. One of his friends is playing pop records like Cher, for example, and things like this. And there's other interviews and so forth. So there's a lot to explore, and those recordings are unique.
Well, here is an interview that I did with Barry Miles, back in 2018 with my collaborator Paul Hartfield. And there's a saying, if you can remember the 60s, you couldn't have been there. But there's another saying, which is that if you can't remember the 60s, that's fine, because Miles wrote it all down. He is quite a countercultural character. Known for his participation and writing on the London Underground and counterculture. Author of numerous books on the beats, including the biographies of Ginsberg, Kerouac, Bukowski, and of course Burroughs. He wrote El Hombre Invisible and William S. Burroughs Alive. He's written a book on the Beat Hotel where Burroughs lived. He's catalogued Burroughs' archive, compiled his bibliography. He's written all sorts of other countercultural books, I think at 70 at last count, including biographies of Frank Zappa, Paul McCartney, Ginsberg, many of the luminaries of the beat scene. He also co-founded the Indiki Gallery, where John Lennon met Yoko Ono, and International Times. And here he is, talking about Burroughs' life in London. Miles, what brought Burroughs to London?
He came to London because he had an affair with this guy Ian Somerville, who was a mathematician who was still studying at Cambridge. And so at the end of the summer, Ian came back to London, and Bill simply followed him. And for the first few years, they stayed in various hotels, mainly in Earl's Court. And then in 67, I think it was, he rented a place on Duke Street, St James, and lived there until 74, so he was there for quite a long time. And Fortnum and Mason's was his corner shop, and where he'd go and get his milk and his salted crackers that he had for lunch. So I enjoy a salted cracker. And then he ate out every single evening. I mean, he's from that kind of generation who never cooked for themselves. So he was living the sort of proper, St James's gentleman's club sort of life. He used to have boyfriends from Piccadilly, Dilly boys, and lived the proper life of a gentleman.
How did you first hear about him?
Through the books. And then I met people who'd actually met him, that he actually was living at the Beat Hotel in Paris. And these are people, when I went to art college, who actually went to Paris. I mean, astonishing to me, and I'd met him and stayed in the hotel, which was very, very cheap and rat infested. And then Naked Lunch appeared. It was published in 1959, and I got a copy probably within 6 months of it being published. And it just blew me away. I just thought, this really tells it like it is, and I'd been, for English O-levels, it was sort of Siegfried Sassoon and all these kind of things is what we were reading, and Dickens, and I had no idea people could write like this. It was brilliant.
Well, how did you actually get, come to be in contact with him?
Well, somehow or other, I got hold of Burroughs' address in Tangier. That's where he was living at the time, and so I was bringing out a little magazine, and I thought it would be nice to publish something of his. So I literally just wrote to him. This would have been in the summer of 1964, and I got back this big letter and a 3 or 4 page manuscript. It was absolutely brilliant. So we had a correspondence. I mean, about really obscure stuff. I mean, he was into Wilhelm Reich's organ accumulators at the time, and we had a conversation about correspondence about whether or not magnetized ones would work better and that kind of stuff.
When did you first meet?
Then when he came to Britain at the end of 65, September 65, I think, and by then I already knew Ian Somerville, oddly enough, who was his boyfriend, and in fact Ian eventually had a room in a house I was renting in Westminster. So I moved into his sort of social circle, and first met him in 65, and then I did a lot of work with him over the years. When I started International Times with Hoppy, we got Burroughs to write for the 2nd issue, the 3rd, the 5th, the 18th. I mean, he was in, if Bill had something to say, he would just give it to us and we would run it. And then the Underground Press Syndicate would syndicate it all over the world. And he loved that, the fact that stuff could be out so quickly.
So who else was in his social circle?
The other person he was hanging out with was Brian Geisen, who was an old friend and collaborator of his, and they worked on the cutups together. And in the end, in fact, Brian moved over into the same building. So Anthony and Brian and Bill lived in 22 Duke Street, St James, and so did Eric Burden from the Animals. So it was it's not a very big building, so it was a bit of a sort of cool building to be in. And then he knew a lot of the Chelsea set. He knew Christopher Gibbs, and he knew the Robert Fraser, the art dealer. He was quite friendly with Robert and spent a lot of time at his place. He moved in mainly gay circles, actually, but he also, since he ate in Soho almost every evening, he got to know the people at the Colony Room pretty well, and the French pub. So he knew Francis Bacon. Although he actually first met Bacon in Tangier. But I used to go with him occasionally to meet Francis, mainly in the Colony, which is where Francis Bacon hung out most of the time. So it was interesting, sort of a mixture of sort of gay people, gangsters, artists.
Junkies?
I don't think he was on junk most of the time he was in Britain, so he didn't really mix with the sort of junkie set. I mean, not that there was much. I mean, apparently by the end of the 60s there were only 200 registered addicts in the entire country. In fact, Burroughs had a doctor who also wrote him a script for marijuana, which was a much more complicated thing. He would go to the doctor and he would say, I'm really feeling very, very paranoid about being busted because I smoke marijuana. So this is a cure for paranoia. So he would give him a script for tincture of cannabis, which comes in a liquid suspension of alcohol, and it's bright green. And Bill used to dip his senior service cigarettes into it, and and he would light up in restaurants, and he was convinced nobody had noticed, but he's smoking this bright green cigarette, which really smelled very strong indeed, But he looked so straight, in his suit and everything, and, no one ever did anything about it.
Well, what was his relationship with London, with the actual
Everywhere
city?
Burroughs lived, he never really noticed the city at all. I mean, as far as I know, he never went to an art gallery or a film or anything. I mean, his life was cerebral. It was all in his head. His characters came to him, half of them in dreams. He liked the sort of popular press. He would get funny clippings and stuff and use them in collages. And he liked later on in the early 70s. He had a great big colour television, which he had turned right up so that the red was really strong, and he particularly liked the riots in Belfast and stuff like that. So yeah, I mean, but he could have been anywhere, And when he was in Paris, he loved it, and then eventually he hated it, and he moved to London and he loved it, and then eventually he hated it. New York, same thing. Tangier, same thing.
Did he do a lot of work here?
Yeah. When he was living in London, he produced The Wild Boys, The Exterminator, The Ticket That Exploded. Well, some of Ticket That Exploded was written here. He produced a lot, and he did a lot of collages and scrapbooks where he combined text and images, and he worked on a lot of films with Anthony Bolsh. Towers Open Fire, Cutups were both made in London, and he did a lot of tape collages as well, cut up tapes where he would record a text and then rewind and go through it and just punch in and read it from newspaper clippings and things like that. Often themed. There would be something like he'd have a big folder of news clippings about bus plunges, for instance, or the number 23 dead in air crash, 23 dead in a riot and stuff. And he had all these things he would read out from in this gravelly voice, And they were really. I liked them a bit. A lot of people find them very difficult listening. Some years ago, I produced a 3 CD box set of them, which. I have to say, it can clear a room pretty fast, actually. But I quite enjoyed it.
Very good. So when did he actually leave, or what did he do next?
So he finally moved back to the States after he left in 1947, or 48, I think, and went back in 74. So he produced almost all of his work while living abroad in Mexico or South America or Tangier or Paris or London. So he basically went home, and then after New York, he went back to the Midwest, not to Missouri where he came from, but to Kansas, which is the next state, and lived quietly with his cats like an old man should.
So that was Miles a couple of years ago. Miles also told us about the famous time-space intervention that Burroughs made in 1972, I think in August, at the Mocha Cafe, just around the corner from here. He claimed that they'd given him food poisoning by serving him some dodgy strawberry cheesecake. So he performed a time-space intervention on them shortly afterwards, which is that he went in there with his tape recorder, recorded the sound in the cafe and took some Polaroids, and then went in the next day, spread the Polaroids out on the table and played the previous day's soundtrack back quite loudly in the cafe as a kind of time-space intervention, and it closed down shortly afterwards. So he claimed it as a successful time-space intervention. I think I can't help thinking that 12 hours of that stuff must get quite exhausting. I mean, it is interesting, isn't it? And of course, because he's interesting and part of his whole history, but I wouldn't have wanted to be the person who had to sit through 12 hours of that, selecting the bits that are going to go on the CD.
It's probably better in small doses, depending on your appetite. Actually, since you mentioned eating out around Piccadilly Circus, also on these tapes is discussing at one point whether or not to go out to the Angus Steakhouse, which is quite prosaic, really.
It's quite interesting then in terms of actually how the Sound Archive, gains its recordings. I mean, so you presumably people get in contact and say, "We've got this. Are you interested?" Sometimes, presumably, they want cash for it. Sometimes that they're prepared to make it as a donation. Is that the way it works? Or do you ever find yourself kind of competing or bidding, as it were, because something's of such importance?
The recordings we have come from a number of different sources. So one would be commercial recordings featuring writers or performances non-musical performances, as far as I'm concerned, in my area. So we try to keep up with those. Often these include kind of artist records and so forth that don't really fit in anywhere else. Unpublished recordings would be another category. So this often happens after somebody dies, but not always. And they may be donated, or somebody may require a fee. I mean, a lot of alternative theatre performers, for example, probably don't have a great provision for supporting their old age. Maybe they've not got great pension plans or anything like that. So it's quite legitimate for people to ask for a bit of money. We have a relationship with BBC Radio, which not everybody knows about. So if you want to hear anything that's been archived by BBC Radio, you can come to the British Library, and if we don't have it already, we can borrow it. And then the fourth category, which brings us up to our next selection, really, is that we make location recordings ourselves, and have done historically over the years. Live theatre performances, a lot of poetry, and this is just kind of one of our USPs, really, because these are all unique recordings that you can't hear anywhere else. They won't be online or on YouTube or anything like that.
Let's have a listen to that second selection.
Can you all hear me? No? Yes. All right. This is from the Forwards, The Place of Dead Roads, a novel I have just completed. The original title of this book was The Johnson Family. Now, the Johnson family was the turn-of-the-century expression to designate good bums and thieves, and it was elaborated into a code of conduct. A Johnson honors his obligations, his word is good, and he's a good man to do business with. A Johnson minds his own business. He is not a snoopy, self-righteous, troublemaking person. A Johnson will give help when help is needed. He will not stand by while someone is drowning, calling for help, or trapped under a car. Nothing extraordinary, just a reasonably well-intentioned person. I recollect Brian Geisen, Eon Somerville, and your reporter sitting at a table in Tangiers having an espresso, and a man walked by. Nothing special to look at. Spanish, middle-aged, obviously poor, shabbily dressed, carrying one of those nameless parcels wrapped in brown paper. Nothing special, no halo, but our mouths dropped open in unison. My God, that's a harmless-looking person. He passed. I never saw him again, but I got the message. That man was a Johnson. He shone with a holy light in contrast to those of another persuasion who seemed to dominate and populate the planet, rushing along to the police station to lodge a complaint or inform on someone, writing letters demanding the return of flogging and capital punishment, urging castration for rioters, leaving little swirls and squiggles of hate and fear and malevolence in the air behind them, literally kept alive by the hope of doing some harm to somebody. And then the vision of a man, just a reasonably well-intentioned person. Very extraordinary and rare indeed in these times.
Well, you just heard a short excerpt from a recording that in its entirety runs 42 minutes. This was made by the British Library. Somebody had the bright idea to go to the Centre Hotel, Liverpool, on the 5th of October 1982 and make a live recording of the whole evening. From that, you can, if you aren't already aware of what Burroughs is like in performance, you can see how the humour is brought out in his delivery. Maybe that doesn't leap out at you so much on the printed page, but he rehearsed properly for these readings.
It was a proper performance, because I mean it's got the characteristics of sort of being rather off the cuff in his distinctive manner, but actually it was all quite rehearsed, was it? So
this was part of a tour called the Final Academy, partly organised by Roger Ely. And there was a show in London, in Brixton, and there was this one in Liverpool, which I think was probably arranged at quite short notice. And the day before that, there had been one at the Hacienda nightclub in Manchester, the Factory Records owned nightclub. This was before the Acid House era, when I think the Hacienda was struggling to find its feet, really. Mainly featured bands, but wasn't by any means full all the time. And I was at college in Manchester at the time, and I did go to the Manchester show to see Burroughs.
Even then he was quite old, wasn't he? I guess. Must have been in his 70s or something, was he, I guess?
He was born in 1914, so in 1982, that makes him, what, Stephen?
68.
Let's go with that.
Right, so you went along, as a sort of young Steve Cleary went along to the Hacienda to see Bill Burroughs, right?
Yeah, and our party had bought tickets in advance to be on the safe side. I remember we had to walk past Marquis Smith of the Fall, who was standing in the queue.
Well, it makes complete sense in terms of the Fall's lyrics, right? When you hear that stuff and that kind of acerbic delivery. Who else was there? Can you remember?
I can remember who was on the bill. Burroughs was supported by the poet John Giorno. And there's also an involvement here with on the part of Genesis P. Origin Psychic TV. So I believe there were some Psychic TV films shown as part of the evening as well. Burroughs did a signing afterwards. A mate of mine got his signature on a scrap of paper. Did
that feel at the time that he was sort of in the presence of a legend? Because, I mean, he was becoming quite legendary then, even though he remained quite accessible, right?
That was part of it. I did enjoy Burroughs' work, so I wasn't just going along to see a famous person.
Somebody had the idea to go and record him, which obviously, in retrospect, turned out to be quite an inspired idea because you collected that as an original recording. And does that still go on? So the Sound Archive still kind of like selects events which they think we've got to catch this for posterity and make sure that we send someone along to with a digital tape recorder these days and catch it all?
We still have a location and recording programme for spoken word. Also, the World of Traditional Music department has gone to the WOMAD Festival for 30 plus years. That's been happening. It's a little bit different because I think in the 1980s, in this period, the curators for the spoken word area probably had the freedom to go off around the country in a van and make recordings at different places. So there were recordings of the Cambridge Poetry Festival, recordings from Edinburgh, all sorts of things. But it was a lot less London centric then than it is now. Of course, a lot of people pass through London, so ultimately it probably doesn't make a lot of difference. But we can't really afford to go off on the road for days on end anymore. But we do record regularly poetry events. We have a link up with the Poet in the City organisation, for example. Literary talks. We have we've had a long relationship with the Royal Society of Literature.
You mentioned poetry then, Steve, and you mentioned John Giorno, who was at the Hacienda show with Burroughs, and this is one of his poems. It's called Raspberry.
Bob Freed was 25 years old, barely 5 feet 8 inches tall, and weighed no more than 135 pounds. His light brown hair was uncombed, and the pupils of his blue eyes were pinned, constricted from a shot of heroin he pumped into himself. He wore dirty black dungarees and a dirty shirt.
And then one day, early this year, at the age of
19,
she tasted
and
death.
philanthropic publishing family,
She came from the
or like a
suburbs,
beneficiary of a trust fund that gave him an allowance of $27,000 a year.
Home and a proud
Bob
family.
Freed was 25 years
And for
old,
2 years with
barely
increasing
5 feet 8
frequency,
inches tall,
She turned on.
and weighed no
she
more than
tasted
135
marijuana
pounds.
And amphetamines.
His light brown
and
hair was
LSD and
uncombed,
heroin.
and the pupils of his
And
blue
then
eyes
one
were
day,
pinned,
early this
constricted
year,
from a
at the
shot of
age
heroin he
19,
pumped into
she
himself.
tasted death.
He wore dirty black dungarees
She
and a
came
dirty
from the
shirt.
suburbs,
He did not look at
intelligent
all
and
like a graduate of
attractive and
Dartmouth
troubled,
College or a
from a
member of a
comfortable
rich
home
and
and a proud
philanthropic
family.
publishing family,
And for 2 years with
or like a
increasing
beneficiary of a
frequency,
trust fund that
she
gave him
turned
an
on,
allowance of
she tasted
$27,000 a
marijuana
year.
and amphetamines.
Bob
and
Freed was
LSD
25
and
years old,
heroin. And
barely
then
5
one
feet
day,
8 inches
early
tall,
this year, at the age
and weighed
of
no more
19,
than
she
135
tasted
pounds.
death.
His light brown hair was uncombed, and the pupils of his blue eyes were pinned, constricted from a shot of heroin he pumped into himself. He wore dirty black dungarees and a dirty shirt. Did not look at all like a graduate of Dartmouth College or a member of a rich and philanthropic publishing family, or like a beneficiary of a trust fund that gave him an allowance of $27,000 a year.
That is an amazing recording and sort of slightly mind-bending, right, as well. It's like some sort of stereophonic thing going on. Tell us about it.
That was an excerpt from an LP that in December 1967 in an edition of 1,000 copies. And it was called The Intravenous Mind Presents Poems by John Giorno. And on one side it had Raspberry, and a part of that we just heard. And on the other side it had something called Pornographic Poem. The female voice was Yvonne Rayner, and the male voice, I think, was Robert Rauschenberg, but it might have been Peter Scheldal, who was also credited. And Giorno is interesting from our point of view because from quite an early point, he was interested in using recording technology as part of performances of poetry. He did kind of live performances with synthesizers and so forth as well. For this, the pornographic poem was a found text. He asked visitors to his flat to read, and he recorded all these different people reading this found text and kind of layered it, as you say, for that side. It's a bit strong, so for this, I thought, in case there's librarians or others of a nervous disposition listening, perhaps we'll go with something from the other side, which is called Raspberry. But also you could hear it's kind of electronically treated and layered. After that, Giorno invented the dial-a-poem service, and this was the first time anybody had done anything like this, I think. He managed to get hold of 10 large metal answering machines. So he's using very primitive and quite bulky technology. Recorded different poems on these 10 machines, and he published a number. And you could ring the number and you would get one of the 10 poems of the day at random. He changed them every day. It was extremely popular, often engaged, something like 14,000 calls a day. This is all in New York, of course. So he's quite an innovator. Later on in the 1980s, They Might Be Giants, the music duo, started something called Dial a Song on a similar principle, but that was just one caller at a time, at least initially. That's still going, actually.
Wow.
So that's something that if you wanted to do it now, probably would be quite easy, but then wasn't easy. It was a real effort. And that led to a record label, Giorno Poetry Systems. Actually, that first LP was probably the first Giorno Poetry Systems record. Giorno Poetry Systems issued a number of spoken word LPs that included various poets, including Ginsberg and Burroughs, musicians, Laurie Anderson, and it was a kind of reflection of the New York art and literature scene, really.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I guess at that time, the very first piece we played, Burroughs, with his reel-to-reel tape recorder and doing sort of cuts and jumps, edits and stuff, and then, using those kind of layered effects. And then that dial-a-poem thing, it was a sort of time, wasn't it, when you've got kind of the cut-up ethos and the kind of experimental ethos of using words in new ways, non-linear ways, coinciding with recording technology, which meant that, or recording technology which individuals could use and which was portable enough to kind of move around and experiment with. So it was those two things kind of collided at that time, didn't they, and produced which produced some completely original at the time work, which now in the age of the kind of computers and technology that we've got, you say, well, that'd be easy to do, but of course then they were innovators, right?
Well, not everybody had access to the technology. I think Burroughs and Guyson were quite quick off the mark. We didn't really have tape recording technology at all until after World War II. The technology came from Nazi Germany. And these machines were fairly expensive, so it wouldn't be a case of every home has one or anything like that. They responded to the technology that was relatively new at the time, creatively, as did Samuel Beckett, of course, with his play Krapp's Last Tape, which is based on somebody listening to tapes he's made in the past, the lead character. If you go and see this short play nowadays, you have to kind of try and imagine what it was like when it's first performed, when this technology was basically new.
There's also something about the quality of it which is not reproducible now, partly because of the technology and the kind of simplicity of it compared with what we've got now in terms of edits and stuff, is that it's got a different kind of feel to it. I had Alan Dean in for we've done. He's done a couple of programs, and I don't know if you know Alan. Actually, he's he's
helped us out a lot, Alan Dean.
Yeah, an oral historian, but also he's very interested in that whole area of recording onto amateur recording onto disc, which overlaps with what we've done in terms of the Soviet recordings. And he makes this point, which I just think is very important in terms of, as you said, post-war era, when people either did have access to tape or those machines that you could put a shilling in and get a record out, is that it was the first time for many people that they'd actually heard their own voice. And that in itself was something quite magical. I mean, we all wince a bit when we first hear our voice recorded. We're not used to it, hearing it that way. But at that time, people just didn't get a chance. There weren't answer machines.
We've fairly recently, I think about a year ago, 2 years ago, acquired one of these voice records ourselves that was made by a soldier, Adrian Montfort, serving in a foreign country. And he sounds fairly relaxed, but some of these examples do sound rather stilted. I was watching this documentary about Ernest Hemingway on the BBC recently, and was flabbergasted to find out that he was terrified of public speaking, certainly being recorded. So he did agree to be recorded for TV, giving a speech of thanks for his Nobel Prize award, but insisted on the words being written out on large cue cards. And when you see this piece of film, he's looking at the cue cards, he's looking back to the camera, and he's reading out a sentence, and he's looking back to the cue card, and you can hardly, credit it. This man who was, fearless in certain situations,
fearless and macho, and a real man, and hunting, shooting, fishing, and stuff.
I mean, I love Ernest Hemingway, but it was a surprise.
So, just to cycle back a second to that Giorno poem that was performed there, tell us a little bit about John Giorno then.
Well, John Giorno was a poet. He seemed to kind of know a lot of people that mattered on the New York art scene. He was Andy Warhol's boyfriend for a while. He was the subject of Warhol's famous film Sleep, which is just a film of somebody sleeping. John Giorno, in fact, sleeping. And I know that he lived in the same building as Burroughs when Burroughs lived in New York in the 80s. But John Giorno's poetry was, he was gay, and he was very upfront about this. I've got a quote here from his book, actually, I'd like to read. So he's talking about how certain artists, he mentions Andy Warhol, Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns, in his opinion, tended to shy away from gay content in their work, possibly fearing that it would have an adverse effect on their careers. He says, they mostly came from poor families, and I was from the upper middle class, which gave me the privilege to do what I wanted. And poets have nothing to lose anyway. William Burroughs's and Allen Ginsberg let me say that again. William Burroughs's and Allen Ginsberg's liberating use of gay images had inspired me in the 1950s. It became my determination and heroic aspiration to take homoeroticism to another level in my work. Perhaps I did it a little too much.
You mentioned Ginsberg, then you've got a recording by him here. I mean, you said earlier that he's probably one of the most recorded poets, certainly of that era. So ahead of this one, which is Ginsberg at Better Books, an excerpt from a mantra. Just tell us about it, Steve.
Better Books was a countercultural hotspot on Charing Cross Road, managed at different times by Miles, who we've mentioned before, and Bob Cobbing, the sound poet. And I wanted to play a little bit from this LP, Allen Ginsberg at Better Books, because for a long time a good copy of this was on my kind of wish list. We did have a copy in the sound archive, but it was a bit battered. And we eventually acquired a pristine copy from Miles, which is great. Miles actually recorded the poetry reading that's on the record on a ferrograph machine himself. So this is from 1965, a little bit of atmosphere really. This is part of a mantra that Allen Ginsberg recited at that sold-out reading.
Om Arabasana de 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 Om Arabasana de de de.
That's Allen Ginsberg's mantra. It's interesting I know that we keep talking about Miles, and of course he is, at the centre of many of these stories and recordings. And I like his story. He told me that because Ginsberg used to stay in his flat in Fitzrovia where Master lives. And I remember he told me that he came out one morning and he could just see Ginsberg's butt up in the air. He was up a ladder and he was fiddling with a fuse box. I think the fuse had blown and the lights had gone out, so he'd gone up there. But of course he loved to be naked, so he was around the flat. So Miles said it's not the sort of thing that you wanted to see first thing in the morning was Ginsberg's hairy butt cheeks.
Well, that was an important reading. It was quite a rare LP as well. It was issued in an edition of 99 copies. Although on the sleeve it says 100 copies, so that's always puzzled me a little bit. Apparently you could avoid paying some kind of tax if you didn't sell more than 100 or more copies. A companion LP, Lawrence Ferlinghetti at Better Books, also existed. Looks very similar. Both of them have covers drawn by the artist Alan Aldridge. And we got this from Miles at the same time. And the Lawrence Ferlinghetti LP is the rarer of the two, because 25 of these 99 or 100 copies were sent in the post to America and promptly disappeared, rendering it an even more limited edition.
Disappeared or were kind of confiscated for some reason?
Lost in the post is my understanding. Yeah, although all these people had run-ins with people implementing censorship at one time or another. Better Books is a story in itself, really. Site for the emerging counterculture. That Ginsberg reading was followed just a few weeks later, I believe, by the International Poetry Incarnation at the Royal Albert Hall, which was a much bigger event, of course. And I think that's widely considered the kind of London counterculture coming out into the open for the first time. Quite a famous event, all planned in the basement of Better Books, I think.
It seems quite unbelievable in a way that poetry could be such an important part of a kind of cultural revolution. I mean, that event in itself, as you say, it kind of seems to kind of kickstart or was part of the things that kickstarted the countercultural 60s here, isn't it? And it's, Royal Albert Hall, June 1965, sold out show with all these poets and all these people there. It's an extraordinary thought, isn't it, these days? When probably for most poets, if they have a book launch these days, it's probably in a tiny bookshop and with an audience of about sort of 15 people, right?
I mean, does an underground in the same sense exist today? Not really. In music terms, I think you could probably say the same thing as you just have said about poetry. It's a totally different landscape. I think it was, I'm projecting a little bit because I don't really know, but it seems to me that the lines of engagement were more starkly drawn. You were either kind of on the progressive side, or you're one of the stiffs in the establishment, stopping everything from happening. And I think everything's kind of a lot more atomized now. I don't know when was the last time there was something you could call an underground movement. I suppose we'd be talking about it in a different way. It wouldn't necessarily have a kind of literary connection anymore, I don't think.
It comes up quite often here, actually, in programs about the counterculture. Where is the counterculture now? Where is the underground? I mean, I'm actually quite optimistic about it. I sort of think that it is there, but by the virtue of the fact it's underground, it may be happening in a place that we don't know about it, or in a way that we don't know about. And I often think maybe halfway up a tower block in Peckham or something. There's probably something going on. But it's just more that the speed of uptake of countercultural and underground ideas is so fast now that it's difficult to actually notice when it's actually happening. We're going to move on to your selection 5, and you mentioned I've never heard of him actually before, but you can tell us about him. Maybe it's Bob Cobbing. Who was he?
Bob Cobbing was a sound poet. He ran the Writers' Forum Press. He was probably the UK's most famous exponent of what was kind of certainly at least a European phenomenon, sound poetry that is kind of conceived of to be heard rather than read. So some of Bob Cobbing's scores you couldn't really read because they're kind of, some of them are just just marks. Some of them are kind of marks distorted by a photocopier, for example. Which he would then interpret. I mean, that's only one side of what he did. But he worked in Better Books as well. And this record, actually, now you mention it, this was on our wish list for a long time. Was issued by Writers' Forum. Yeah, this was 1965 as well. So this was a one-sided LP, Bob Cobbing on one side and Ernst Jandl on the other. Side 1 was this long piece called Sound Poems by Cobbing, recorded at Better Books again. The British Library acquired Bob Cobbing's manuscript archive, and then a couple of years after that we acquired his tape archive. So in addition to this, we have a lot of the small press publications, many issued by Writers' Forum, that he was involved with. So we're kind of your one-stop shop for Bob Cobbing, the British Library.
Adventure, aventure, aventureux, adventure, aventure, aventureuse, adventurous, à l'aventure, dire la bonne aventure, aventurier, aventurière, aveugle, aveugle, à l'aveuglette, bombast, 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 en phase, en phase, bombast, en phase, bombast. Fibu.
Bonkers. I mean, that's in the sort of classic 60s way. I can imagine lots of earnest people sitting around staring while this guy's making strange noises, like sort of like Dali, with his Dali-esque stuff. Only in those days, right? It's difficult to imagine that these days, right, Steve?
Apparently, it was all right if you laughed. If that was your reaction, I think that was fine. In the British Library, we used to put out literary themed CDs. We don't do this anymore. It's kind of yesterday's format, really. But we did put together a compilation drawn from the Bob Cobbing archive, and it received my favourite review of anything we've ever done. This was Stuart Lee in the Sunday Times, and he wrote, "This superb British Library selection from Cobbing's archive of chants, rants and growls, many of them not commercially available before, opens with a 22-minute piece called 26 Sound Poems, which has all the ritualistic gravity of Ginsberg's Howl, but is shorn, like everything here, of such cheap tricks as sense and meaning." which is basically what you said.
Very good. Well, Steve, we're sort of moving to the end. We've got your last piece coming up, and of course it's a cracker. But I wanted, just before we do, to let people know some more about what actually you do. I've sort of been in the sound archive in the basement, and it's quite an extraordinary place. And the thing is that obviously you can check out online now nearly all everything's catalogued, isn't it? I'm sure you're sort of taking new stuff in, but you can sort of just request that you can go in there, and somebody there will take something out of the catalogue and allow you to hear it. It's quite extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, I just wonder how many people know about that.
We do have an online portal, sounds.bl.uk, where something like 80,000 sounds are available to listen to freely. We're updating this resource with a new sounds website, which will probably be launched early next year with many, many more thousands of recordings. But it's quite a business to get to that point, because you have to digitize the material from whatever its original carrier is. And if you're going to put it online, you have to go through proper rights clearance. So we're a state-subsidized institution. We can't just do what we like. We have to obey the copyright regulations. So that's quite an involved business. But I think it will be worth it, and I think people will be. It's an enormously expanded selection. That's probably next spring. If you want to hear anything in the Sound Archive, you will have to get yourself a reader pass, and there's instructions on www.bl.uk.
So we're going to finish with Steve's last selection, and it involves Neal Cassidy, Dean Moriarty in On the Road, and the driver of the Merry Pranksters bus with his buddy Jack Kerouac. Tell us about it, Steve.
Yeah, this is from a tape that was given to us by Carolyn Cassidy, and it features both Jack Kerouac and Neal Cassidy at home. This is a recording they made on an echo tape machine that used paper tape, apparently. The original paper tape is long gone, so this is maybe not even a first-generation copy. Carolyn Cassidy, I think, wrote the first memoir of the leading lights of the Beat Generation. There was an account by a woman. That was her book Heartbeat in 1976. It's interesting to hear Kerouac on this. It's totally informal, and unlike Allen Ginsberg, he wasn't recorded that much in his lifetime. He died early, of course, and since then one or two things have come to light, and this is one of them. Of course, he was a big jazz fan, doing a bit of scat singing at home.
Great stuff, that, wasn't it? Actually, he could sing.
Yeah. We never know with jazz, though.
Steve Cleary, thanks very much for coming to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
Thank you very much for having me.
And thank you, listener. I trust you enjoyed it. If you dug that, as Kerouac might have said, as much as I did, you can dig all our other semi-buried, semi-unearthed, recollected, collected, rare stories and rare audio from the counterculture, from the other side, from the underground. at bureauoflostculture.com, and of course these days on all your favourite podcast providers. Do leave us a review if you listen to us via Apple. We'd really appreciate that. See you, hear you next time. I'm Stephen Coates. This was the Bureau of Lost Culture.